If you have just settled beneath your quilt, dear listener, and the lamp at your bedside is turned low, and the small fire upon your hearth has begun to whisper its slow gray lullaby, then come closer to the fender and let the candle gutter as it pleases. The night is large and the world is quiet, and we have a long, gentle tale before us. It begins, as so many of our stories do, in an English country house upon a damp October evening, when the rooks were calling above the elms and the autumn mist had begun to settle in the long valleys of Warwickshire, and a 22-year-old lady's maid stood at the foot of the great oak servants' stair of Whitlock Hall, with a folded square of pale, unbleached linen over one arm, and a small brass thimble at her hip, and the unspoken intention of mending in the long quiet of the small hours a single torn coat that did not belong to her. Her name was Constance Marchand Pickering, but everyone in the household had called her Connie since she had come up from Coventry in the spring of 1808 at the age of 16, on the recommendation of her aunt Miss Adeline Marchand, who had been the late Duchess's own woman from 1803 until 1807, and on the introduction of Mrs. Adelaide Yates Tannahill, the housekeeper of the Hall, who had received Connie at the kitchen door on a cold March afternoon and had offered her a hot cup of tea and a place. Connie had walked, in the brief and unflattering account of her own arrival she had given the housekeeper that afternoon, the 8 miles from the inn at Stratford-upon-Avon, at which the Coventry coach had set her down, on her own 2 17-year-old feet, with a single small canvas traveling case in her right hand, containing 2 changes of household linen, a clean white apron her aunt had laid for her in the case, a small leather Bible of her late mother's, the small pair of curved gilt embroidery scissors her late mother had used at the same age, the small brass thimble her late grandmother had used at the same age before that, and a small silver and pearl mourning brooch on a tarnished silver chain. She had, on the 8 miles of the walk, in the soft, cold March drizzle of the second week of the Cotswold spring, kept the case under her left arm to keep the linen dry, and had arrived at the kitchen door of the hall with her bonnet wet through and her hands red across the knuckles. Mrs. Yates Tannahill, who had answered the bell, had looked at her once across the threshold, had taken the case from her by the handle without asking permission, had sat her down at the kitchen table, had set a clean teacup of hot, strong tea in front of her, had laid a clean, fresh slice of fruitcake from a Sunday tea on a small chip plate beside the tea, and had said, in the same soft voice she would use with Connie 16 autumns later, in the same kitchen on the morning the Duke would summon her at last by name to the library, the 7 words that began Connie's 17-year service in that house. The 7 words were, "Mary Magdalene at the well, dear. Drink." Connie drank. Mrs. Yates Tannahill watched her drink. Mrs. Yates Tannahill said, after the first cup, the second sentence, "Now then, dear, tell me about your mother." Connie's mother had died, dear listener, of a long, slow consumption in Coventry in the autumn of 1805, leaving Connie at 14 with her Aunt Adeline at Whitlock Hall, and a small sister of 4 named Letitia, who had been put into the care of a married cousin in Worcester. Connie's father, Mr. Septimus Pickering, who had been a journeyman printer at the small Coventry press of Mr. Marchand, the publisher's first cousin, until his own consumption had taken him in 1803, had left Connie no inheritance whatever beyond his late mother's brass thimble, his late wife's small leather Bible, and the slim pair of curved gilt embroidery scissors which had been bought for the late Mrs. Pickering's wedding by her own godmother in 1788. Connie's Aunt Adeline had not, in the years between Mr. Pickering's death and her own decision in 1807 to leave the late Duchess's service to marry a small Cotswold farmer named Mr. Holcombe Pendergrass Marchand, ever lost sight of her young niece in Coventry. Adeline had, in the spring of 1808, sent for Connie. Adeline had introduced Connie to Mrs. Yates Tannahill at the kitchen door. Adeline had, the day after the introduction, sat Connie down in the small servants' parlor off the kitchen, taken Connie's hands in her own steady seamstress's hands, and explained to Connie, in plain, steady words, that the late Duchess Lucinda, who had been at that hour 23 years old, 6 months married, and the brightest, small, careful young woman Adeline had ever served, was a duchess who would, given a careful 16-year-old girl with a steady seamstress's hand, teach the girl every fine art of the wardrobe over the 18 months ahead, and that the 18 months ahead would, by Adeline's own steady estimate, be the 18 months that determined what kind of woman Connie became at 30. Connie had been the late Duchess Lucinda's lady's maid for the 18 months between her arrival in March 1808 and Lucinda's death of a swift and unrelenting fever in the autumn of 1809. The 18 months had been the 18 months Adeline had described. She had been kept on by the household at Mrs. Yates Tannehill's quiet recommendation, and had been, in the 5 years between, the upper housemaid in charge of the family wardrobe, with particular responsibility for the linen of the 7th Duke of Whitlock, who had inherited the title from his father in the same month his wife had died, who had, in those 5 autumns, never spoken to any of the female household by any name other than the polite, formal name proper to her station, and who had, in the long quiet of the same 5 autumns, slowly and not without dignity, been turning into a man who had loved his late wife very much and did not know how to wear the title without her. The house in those years had not, dear listener, been the bright, laughing house it had been in the late Duchess's time. The roses in the south front border had grown a little wilder for the lack of her hand. The drawing-room piano had not been sat at by any visiting cousin. The supper bell had rung only for the Duke, and, when his sister Lady Cornelia came down from London on the 3rd weekend of every month, for her also. The household had been kept by Mrs. Yates Tannehill and the careful, steady steward Mr. Holcombe Pendergrass, in the precise, quiet order in which the late Duchess had left it. The drawing-room curtains were drawn back at 7:30 each morning. The beeswax was applied to the dining-room table on Tuesdays and Saturdays. The small coronet rose bush at the corner of the south terrace was pruned on the 2nd Sunday of November each year. The household had become, in the way a household around a quiet grief becomes, a kind of long, slow, musical note held by 60 people for 5 years. Connie, for her own part, had loved the late Duchess. She had loved her in the careful, particular way a girl of 16 loves a kind woman of 23 who teaches her, in the small private hour between the dressing for dinner and the dressing for bed, the names of the silk threads and the proper turn of a fly-stitch and the lines of 7 different psalms. The Duchess Lucinda had, on Connie's first afternoon in the Upper East ladies' maid's chamber, sat down beside her on the truckle bed in a long-sleeved morning dress of pale, rose-colored silk, and had said, in the small, careful voice that was Lucinda's voice always, "Connie, your aunt has spoken of you very kindly. I shall not, in our time together, address you as a household servant. I shall address you as a young woman whose hands are in training under mine, on the explicit understanding that the training is to be of use to you wherever you go after this house, whether you remain in it or not, whether I remain in it or not, whether the great matter of life works out as we plan or as it pleases. The arts of fine needlework which I shall teach you across the next several years are arts that travel. They are arts a woman may take into any kitchen, any rectory, any cottage, any chamber, and earn a steady, careful living of dignity by them. They are not, Connie, the arts of a household servant. They are the arts of an Englishwoman of small, careful patience, whose hands will, in any room, be useful. Begin tomorrow at 6. We start with the threads. The Duchess had begun the next morning at 6 with the threads. She had laid out on a clean square of unbleached linen on the small pine sewing table by the dormer window of the chamber Connie had been given 30 colors of fine silk thread on small wooden bobbins, and had named them all. pale gold, deep gold, claret, burgundy, bottle green, sage, leaf, sap, indigo, dove gray, slate, oyster, ivory, ecru, cream, rose, peach, salmon, vermilion, scarlet, plum, violet, and the 7 shades of brown the Duchess kept for landscape needlework, which she had begun, in her 17th year, to undertake at the encouragement of her own teacher in Hertfordshire. She had taught Connie, that first morning, the proper turn of a fly stitch, the proper turn of a split stitch, the proper turn of a herringbone, and the proper turn of a French knot. She had set Connie, on the second morning, to copy a single small primrose from a sample card the Duchess had brought from her own girlhood. The primrose Connie copied that second morning, dear listener, has hung framed in the morning room at Whitlock Hall since the autumn of 1808, when the Duchess herself had taken it from Connie's hand and had it framed without telling Connie. On the small private grounds that Connie was the kind of 17-year-old whose first attempt would, on second look at the age of 40, be the kind of work she would not believe she had done. The Duchess had, in the 18 months between Connie's arrival and her own death, taught Connie the names of every thread the Duchess herself used, the proper turn of 14 different stitches, the small, careful application of an embroidery frame, the methods of letting out and taking in a high-waisted bodice for the variations of expectant ladies in country houses, the proper press of a fine wool tailcoat, the laundering of West of England superfine, the keeping of a wardrobe inventory in the small, careful, slim, leather-bound book the late Duchess had given Connie on her 17th birthday in the spring of 1809. The lines of the 7 Psalms she had her ladies' maids learn by heart, the 23rd, the 27th, the 46th, the 91st, the 121st, the 139th, and the 148th. The small, careful shape of a country house Sabbath, which the late Duchess kept until her death, and which Connie has kept in the same household every Sunday for 16 years since, and the small, private domestic grace by which a young Duchess of 23 taught a young lady's maid of 17 what kind of woman a young woman might decide, given a useful pair of hands and a kind teacher, to become at 30. The Duchess Lucinda died, dear listener, on the morning of the 11th of October, 1809, of a swift and unrelenting putrid fever. The village physician had not been able, in the 4 days of his attendance, to identify in any of his pamphlets. She was 24 years old. She had been 6 weeks confined to her bed at the start of what she had whispered on the second day of the fever, to Connie alone in the small private hour at the dressing for bed, was the second small private hope of expectancy she had not yet told the Duke. The expectancy had been, in the careful judgment of the village physician at his arrival on the 3rd day of the fever, perhaps 11 weeks established. The fever took the Duchess and the small private second hope together. Connie sat with the Duchess across the 4 nights of the fever in the careful, slow seamstress's vigil her Aunt Adeline had taught her at her late mother's bedside in 1805. The Duchess held Connie's hand on the morning of the 11th between 5:15 and the moment 6:15, at which the Duchess's hand quietly released Connie's of its own accord. The Duchess said, in the last small private sentence she said to anyone in the household, between 5:30 and 5:31, in the careful voice that was Lucinda's voice always, "Connie, promise me you will continue. The hands, the threads, the Duchess, the household. He will need them." Connie said, "I promise, Your Grace." The Duchess said, "Mary Magdalene at the well, dear?" Connie was holding her hand at 6:15. The late Duchess had embroidered, in the second autumn of her marriage in the year 1808, a single waistcoat for the Duke in dark green superfine wool from a West of England mill, with a fine fly-stitch border in pale gold silk thread along the lapel, and a single small heraldic pomegranate at the inner left breast in red silk thread. The pomegranate, Connie had once been told by the Duchess herself, was the small private device of the De Winter family, taken from an old Crusader-era seal in the late Duchess's own family on her mother's side, and had been embroidered into the inner left breast in red silk thread because the inner left breast was the place over the heart, and the Duchess had said, with the soft, small smile she used when she was being tender, at a small remove from solemnity, that her heart belonged, in particular, to the man who would be wearing the waistcoat. The Duke had worn the waistcoat under his everyday coat from the December of 1808, when she had finished it, until the autumn of 1809, when she had died. He had not worn it, for the 5 autumns since, on any occasion of importance. He had had it laundered and pressed and hung. He had worn it on quiet evenings in the library, in private, where no one would remark upon it. He had worn it on the morning of Tuesday, the 25th of October, 1814, on the morning ride at 9:30, with a heavy charcoal greatcoat over the top, in the company of his huntsman, Mr. Pendergrass, and a small party of 3 local gentry, on a chase across the upper Deer Park toward Knowle Brook. The chase had been a routine one. The horses had been sound. The gentry had been polite. The morning, by every account in the housekeeper's notebook, had carried no unusual weight. The Duke's mare, a grey of 7 years called Esther, had stumbled in a soft patch of bracken on the upper bank of the brook at 20 minutes past 10. She had not gone all the way down. She had pitched forward and recovered, and the Duke had, in the small, careful instinct of a man who had been at sea for the years his peers had been in the Lords, kept his seat by the small mercy of his hands rather than by any extraordinary horsemanship. He had not been thrown. He had only been raked in the right side of the breast by a low, overhanging branch of a blackthorn that the huntsman had not properly cut back the previous winter. The blackthorn had taken, with a single, bright clean tearing, the dark green superfine wool waistcoat through, from the upper edge of the lapel down to a point 3 inches above the bottom seam, in a single jagged tear that had also, in the same motion, torn the dark charcoal superfine tailcoat of the Duke's outer coat in the same line. Eowyn, the Duke had said, by the huntsman's account afterward, only one word. The word was Lucinda. He had finished the chase. He had ridden home. He had handed Esther to the head groom at the stable yard at 20 minutes past 1. He had walked across the south terrace and into the library by the south door without speaking to any member of the household. He had taken off the charcoal greatcoat and the dark charcoal tailcoat. He had laid them across the back of the horsehair settee in the library. He had not removed the dark green waistcoat. He had sat down at the large mahogany partner's desk under the green-shaded oil reading lamp. He had put both hands flat on the green leather inlay. He had bowed his head very slightly. He had not, in the 4 hours between his arrival in the library and Mrs. Yates Tannehill's first knock at the door at 5:30, rung any bell. Mrs. Yates Tannehill had come into the library at 5:30, by her own quiet calculation that the Duke had not had luncheon, with a small silver tray bearing a covered dish of cold beef and mustard sandwiches, a stoneware pot of strong tea, and a single slice of seed cake. She had set the tray on the desk. She had said, in the careful, soft voice she used with the Duke when she had decided he was not, in that particular hour, to be left to himself, "Your Grace, the fire wants tending? May I?" The Duke had said, "Yes, Mrs. Yates Tannehill, thank you." He had not lifted his head. Mrs. Yates Tannehill had tended the fire. She had drawn the curtains across the 3 south windows. She had turned up the wick of the green-shaded oil reading lamp. She had paused at the door. She had looked at the dark green waistcoat and at the long, jagged tear from the upper lapel down through to 3 inches above the bottom seam. She had looked at the Duke's bowed head. She had said, in the same careful, soft voice, "Your Grace, the waistcoat will mend. There are hands in this house that know how." He had not lifted his head. He had said, in a voice she had not heard him use in 5 years, "It will not mend, Mrs. Yates Tannehill. The thread is not in the house any longer." She had said, after the small, careful pause in which she had calculated, in her 38 years of housekeeping at Whitlock Hall, exactly what she was going to say next. "Your Grace. The thread, if I may speak plainly, is in this house." The Duchess kept her workbox in the upper east cupboard of the morning room. "The morning room has not been opened in 5 years on your standing instruction. I have, however, had the cupboard kept dust-free on my own initiative. The thread is in there. The bobbins of pale gold silk, 18 of them. The bobbin of dark red silk, 3 of them. There is enough to mend the lapel and the pomegranate twice over." He had not lifted his head. He had said only, "Mrs. Yates Tannehill, I shall sit here for some time longer. I shall not eat the sandwiches. I shall not ring. I should be obliged if no one were to come into the library again until the morning." He had paused. He had said, with the small tightening at the back of the voice that gave him away, "I shall wear the coat to Westminster in the morning. The Lords sit on the Corn Laws Bill at noon. I have prepared the speech. I shall wear the coat. The waistcoat is what I shall wear, Mrs. Yates Tannehill. I shall not have it changed." He had lifted his head then, only briefly, and had given Mrs. Yates Tannehill the small, steady look of a man who had not been undone by anything in 5 years and who was, at that hour, very nearly undone. He had said, "Good night." Mrs. Yates Tannehill had left the library. She had closed the door behind her. She had stood in the corridor for the count of perhaps 10 of the long case clock's slow seconds. She had then climbed the great oak servants' stair to the 3rd floor of the east wing, where she had knocked, very quietly, on the closed door of a small attic chamber. The voice that had answered after a moment had been quiet and steady. Mrs. Yates Tannehill had opened the door. Connie had been seated at her small pine sewing table by the dormer window, in the lighter day dress of the household issue without the apron, with a small, folded square of pale, unbleached linen across her lap, mending, in the careful, slow manner her aunt had taught her, the upper hem of one of the late Duchess's morning-room curtains that had begun to fray at the brass rod. Connie had looked up. Mrs. Yates Tannehill had taken 3 steps into the chamber. She had closed the door behind her. She had said, in the same soft voice she had used with the Duke, "Connie, I should like, if you would, to ask you a thing that the Duke has not asked of you." She had laid out, in plain, steady words and in 2 short minutes, the matter of the morning's chase, the blackthorn branch, the tear in the dark green, superfine wool waistcoat embroidered by the late Duchess in the autumn of 1808, and the Duke's intention to wear the waistcoat to the floor of the House of Lords at Westminster in the morning to deliver the speech against the autumn's Corn Laws amendment that the Lord Liverpool government was, by Mrs. Yates Tannehill's accurate intelligence, from the Duke's London valet, who was a cousin of the steward at Whitlock, and in regular weekly correspondence, in some quiet difficulty about and against which the Duke's vote was, in the ranking of the crossbench peers, to be in some particular degree decisive. She had laid out, in the same plain, steady words, that the late Duchess had embroidered the waistcoat in the 2nd autumn of her marriage, that the pale gold silk thread and the red silk thread were, she had reason to know, still kept in the upper east cupboard of the morning room which had been on the standing instruction of the Duke for 5 years closed, that she had, on her own initiative, kept the cupboard dust-free, and that the work, the mending of a long, jagged tear in superfine wool of the kind made at the Stroud Mills, with the salvage of the upper part of a fly-stitch border in pale gold silk, and a small heraldic pomegranate in red silk on the inner left breast, was a piece of work that no London tailor would, in the 8 hours between the present hour and the carriage's 8 o'clock departure for Westminster the next morning, undertake, and that even if a London tailor would undertake it, the work was not the work a London tailor would do well. She had said, in the same soft voice, "Connie, the thread, the needle, the 8 hours. The waistcoat, ma'am, will be brought down to your hand at 6:30 this evening in the library by my own carrying. The Duke will not know it has been brought down. The waistcoat will be returned to its hanger in the Duke's bedchamber at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning by my own carrying, in time for him to dress for the 7 o'clock departure. The Duke will not, between 6:30 this evening and the moment he puts on the waistcoat in the morning, know that it has been mended. He has said, in plain words, that the waistcoat will not mend. He has said it because his Duchess is not in this house to mend it. He has not said it because there is no other hand in this house that knows the work. There is. The hand is yours, Connie. I am not, in this conversation, ordering you. I am asking you. I have not asked you for any unusual thing in the 6.5 years you have been at this hall. And I shall not ask you for an unusual thing again. Will you mend the coat?" Connie had set the morning room curtain down on the small pine sewing table. She had folded her small, careful, steady hands in her lap. She had thought about it for the count of perhaps 3 of her own slow heartbeats. She had said, in the small, steady voice that had never been raised in any chamber of Whitlock Hall by any member of the household, "I will mend the coat, Mrs. Yates Tannahill. The thread, please, by 6:30. The waistcoat by the same hour. I shall need 3 of the bobbins of pale gold and 1 of the dark red. I shall need 1 new packet of the finest sail needles from the steward's cupboard, and the small pair of curved gilt scissors which I have, and the small embroidery frame from the morning room which the Duchess used in 1808, which Mrs. Yates Tannahill, ma'am, you will know is in the morning room cupboard with the thread. I shall not need anything else. I shall be at this table when the waistcoat comes. I shall return the waistcoat to your hand at 5 tomorrow morning. The Duke will not know." Mrs. Yates Tannahill had nodded once. She had said, "Thank you, Connie. I shall come up at 6:30. She had gone out. She had closed the door behind her. Connie had sat for a moment longer at her small sewing table by the dormer window in the careful pale gold light of the late October dusk. Then she had stood. She had washed her hands twice in the chipped white porcelain basin on the pine washstand. She had taken off her apron and put on a fresh one. She had laid out on the small pine deal-top sewing table a single fresh sheet of the unbleached linen as a clean working cloth, the small flat tin candlestick with a fresh tallow candle as yet unlit, the small pair of curved gilt embroidery scissors, the small leather thimble cup, the small velvet leaf of needles, and a folded square of fresh pale linen for the lap. She had taken from her wooden sewing box, very carefully, the small spool rack on which she kept, in the careful, slow ordering her aunt had taught her, the 30 colors of fine silk thread on small wooden bobbins. She had checked, with one careful eye, that the small bone hairpins in her hair were tight. She had drawn the rush-seated chair up to the table. She had sat. She had folded her hands. She had waited. If you will, dear listener, draw the quilt a little closer about your shoulders and stir the small fire on your hearth before it falls quite into ash. We shall stay with Connie through the long quiet of the small hours. Because what she did at her small pine sewing table by the single tallow candle in the dormer window chamber of the east wing of Whitlock Hall on the night of Tuesday, the 25th of October, 1814, is, in its quiet way, the work that is going to determine the rest of the story. Mrs. Yates Tannahill brought the waistcoat at 6:23. She brought it folded in a clean square of pale linen of her own, on her own arm, up the back stair, with the 18 bobbins of pale gold silk thread, and the 3 bobbins of dark red silk thread in a small lacquered black workbox on her other arm, and the small tortoiseshell and pearl embroidery frame the late Duchess had used in 1808 tucked under the elbow of the workbox arm. She set the workbox on the table. She unfolded the linen and laid the waistcoat out flat. She stepped back. The two of them looked at it without speaking. The tear, Connie saw at once, was worse than Mrs. Yates Tannehill's gentle description had allowed. It ran in a single jagged, irregular line from the upper lapel across the dark green superfine wool, taking the fly-stitch border of the late Duchess's pale gold silk in 3 places, and ran down across the inner left breast through the upper edge of the small heraldic pomegranate in red silk, which was now half disintegrated at the upper curve. The wool itself had not, in the brief mercy of the blackthorn's clean tear, frayed badly at the edges. The tear was a tear and not a rip, but the embroidery had gone. The pomegranate, in particular, had gone from a finished thing to a thing in 2 halves with a dozen loose ends of red silk thread along the line of the tear. Mrs. Yates Tannehill said, very quietly, in the chamber, "Connie, the pomegranate is the part. The lapel is the part. Do what you can. He will know if the wool is sound. He will know if the line is sound. He will not know. He is not, after all, a needlewoman. Exactly what stitch you have done, if the stitch is fine enough that the eye does not see it." The Duchess used a split stitch on the pomegranate and a fly stitch on the lapel border. "I shall leave you. I shall not knock again. I shall come at 5. She left. Connie was alone with the coat. She lit the tallow candle from the small fire on the chamber's low cast-iron coal grate. The candle steadied. She drew the rush chair close. She put her thimble on. She slid the embroidery frame open and stretched the inner left breast of the waistcoat in it, with the half pomegranate at the center. She threaded a single fine sail needle with 3 plies of the dark red silk thread. Drawn from one of the bobbins, she made one steady test split stitch in the inner edge of the wool away from the design, where it would not show. The stitch held. She broke the test stitch out with her thumbnail. She pulled a length of fresh silk through the needle. She laid the right hand on the wool of the waistcoat. She bowed her head. She made the first proper stitch. The work she did between 6:30 in the evening of the 25th and 4:50 in the morning of the 26th, dear listener, is the kind of work that does not come well into prose. A skilled embroideress will know what was done. A reader who has never held a fine needle in a small chamber on a long night may take it on faith that the work was done. It will be enough to say that Connie reconstructed the upper curve of the pomegranate in 1,243 split stitches in 3 plies of dark red silk over the course of 3 hours and 20 minutes, working from the late Duchess's own clean, straight stitch line on the surviving lower curve as her template, and that she reconstructed the broken 3 sections of the pale gold silk fly-stitch border along the lapel in 2 hours and 8 minutes, and that she closed the long, jagged, irregular tear in the wool itself in a hand darning of fine herringbone in pale green wool thread of the matching shade carefully drawn from the inner seam allowance of the waistcoat itself by the lifting and relaying of 3 3/4 inches of inner lining in 2 hours and 40 minutes, and that she pressed the work flat with a hand iron heated on the coal grate and a clean, wet pressing cloth at 4:30, and that she folded the waistcoat in Mrs. Yates Tannehill's clean square of pale linen at 4:50, and laid it at the foot of her own attic chamber door for Mrs. Yates Tannehill at 4:52, and that Mrs. Yates Tannehill came up the stair on her own 2 old housekeeper's feet, and took the bundle without knocking and without entering the chamber at 4:58, and that Connie blew out the tallow candle at 5:01, and lay down on the iron-framed truckle bed under the faded patchwork quilt in her uniform without removing it, and slept for 1 hour and 43 minutes the dreamless sleep of a young woman who has done a thing she did not know whether she could do. The Duke dressed at 6:15. He did not, by his valet's account afterward to the steward, who told it that evening to Mrs. Yates Tannehill in confidence, examine the dark green superfine wool waistcoat with any unusual closeness when the valet brought it from the wardrobe. He was distracted that morning. He was thinking of his speech. He held the waistcoat for a moment before he put it on, as he had done every other autumn morning of those 5 years on which he had worn it, the way a man holds a thing his late wife has made for him. He put it on. The valet buttoned it. The valet handed him the dark charcoal superfine tailcoat, also pressed and quietly mended overnight by Mrs. Yates Tannehill's own hand, in a separate quiet kindness no one in the household ever mentioned. The Duke buttoned the tailcoat over the waistcoat. He turned to the long pier glass on the bedchamber wall. He looked at himself in the glass for the count of, by the valet's later quiet description, perhaps 18 seconds. He did not say anything. He raised his right hand and laid 2 fingers over the inner left breast of the waistcoat, where, under the line of the dark charcoal tailcoat, the small heraldic pomegranate in red silk thread sat over his heart. The fingers stayed there for perhaps 3 seconds longer. He took the fingers away. He picked up his hat and his gloves from the bedside table. He went down to the carriage. He left for Westminster at 7 o'clock, as he had said he would. The Duke of Whitlock rose to speak in the House of Lords at 12 minutes past 1 on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 26th of October, 1814. He spoke for 48 minutes. The Lords' Gallery, by the account in the next morning's Times, was unusually full for an autumn session debate. Lord Byron was reported to have been in the gallery, and 3 MPs from the Commons, and the wife of the Earl of Carlisle, all of whom had been told privately by the Duke's London cousin that the speech was likely to be remarkable. The speech argued, in steady, measured prose, against the autumn's amendment to the Corn Laws Bill on 3 grounds: the agricultural, the constitutional, and the moral, and concluded, in the small, careful peroration the Duke had drafted 3 nights before, with a sentence the Times the next morning printed in italics, and which has, since, been quoted in several histories of the period. My lords, the bread of England is not a luxury, and the table at which the laborer takes it is not in this country a table at which the legislator may set the price by his own convenience. We are not a government over a people. We are stewards of a household. The household is not ours to starve. The amendment was defeated by a majority of 14. 5 crossbench peers who had been wavering voted with the Duke. Lord Liverpool's government withdrew the amendment in committee the following Monday. The Corn Laws debate of the autumn of 1814, dear listener, was, by the small private account in the housekeeper's notebook at Whitlock Hall, which I have been allowed to read for the preparation of this telling, defeated by a single speech, which was delivered in a single dark green superfine wool waistcoat, embroidered by the late Duchess Lucinda de Winter in the autumn of 1808, and mended on the long night of the 25th of October, 1814, by Constance Marchand Pickering, lady's maid, working alone at a small pine sewing table by a single tallow candle in a small attic chamber at the top of the east wing servants' stair. The Duke returned from Westminster on the late train on the evening of the 3rd of November, 8 days after the speech. He went, on his return, directly to the library. He rang the bell, for the first time since the spring of 1809, for Mrs. Yates Tannehill. She came. He asked her to close the door. She closed it. He asked her, in a steady voice that was nevertheless not the voice he had used to her in 5 years, whether she would be so good as to summon the upper housemaid in charge of the family wardrobe to the library, whose name he had, until that hour, been unable, despite his shame in admitting it, to recall. Mrs. Yates Tannehill told him, in the same careful soft voice she had used with him a week earlier, that the upper housemaid in question was Constance Marchand Pickering, that she had been at the Hall since the spring of 1808, that she had been the late Duchess's lady's maid for 18 months, and that she was at that hour in the morning room mending the late Duchess's drawing-room curtains. The Duke received the information without changing expression. He said, "Mrs. Yates Tannahill, be so good as to ask Miss Marchand Pickering whether she would be willing to come to the library at her convenience." Connie came at 20 minutes past 9. She knocked twice. She entered. She stopped 2 paces inside the door and dipped a small, careful curtsy, with her hands folded at her apron in front of her, and her eyes lowered to the carpet in the proper deferential angle her aunt had taught her. The Duke was standing at the long mahogany partner's desk. He was wearing the dark charcoal superfine tailcoat over the dark green superfine wool waistcoat. He had, in the 8 days, not changed the waistcoat. He had had it laundered each evening by Mrs. Yates Tannahill's own hand and quietly returned to him each morning. He looked at Connie for perhaps 4 of the long case clock's slow seconds. He said, in a voice that was not steady, "Miss Marchand Pickering, I should like to ask you, with your permission, to look at this waistcoat. Will you take 5 paces forward, please, ma'am?" Connie lifted her eyes. She took 5 paces forward. She stopped. The Duke turned the front of the waistcoat slightly so that she could see the inner left breast clearly under the green-shaded lamp. He drew a fingertip down the line of the mended tier from the upper lapel through the reconstructed pomegranate. He said quietly, "Miss Marchand Pickering. The work on this lapel is a fly stitch in 3 plies of pale gold silk that is, by my eye, indistinguishable in pitch and tension from the original work my late wife laid down in this border in the autumn of 1808. The work on this inner left breast is a split stitch in 3 plies of dark red silk that has, in the upper curve of the pomegranate, reproduced the original drawing line of my late wife's hand to within a fraction of a single thread, and has done so without any reference to the original. Because the original, ma'am, was destroyed by the blackthorn branch on the morning of the 25th, and what is in the upper curve at this hour is not the original. The work on the wool itself is a hand darning in fine herringbone that has been done in pale green wool thread of an exact matching shade that is not, I am informed by the supplier in Stroud, who made the cloth in 1808, available for sale, and was not in 1808 available for sale, and was, by my own quiet inference, drawn from the inner seam allowance of this very waistcoat, by the lifting and relaying of approximately 3 3/4 inches of the inner lining. Miss Marchand Pickering, may I ask you, did you do this work?" Connie said, in the small, steady voice she had used since the morning of the porch. "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "Did Mrs. Yates Tannahill ask you to do it?" She said, "Yes, Your Grace." He said, "Did you sleep, ma'am, between the 6:30 of Tuesday evening and the 5 of Wednesday morning?" She said, "No, Your Grace." He said, after a long, quiet pause, "Will you sit, please, Miss Marchand Pickering? There is a wing chair to your right at the fire. I should like, with your permission, to sit also. The standing has been, in the last quarter hour, more than I expected." She said, very quietly, "Your Grace, it would not be proper." He said, "Ma'am, it has been 5 autumns since I have used the word proper in this room, and I am not at this hour in a position to begin again. Mrs. Yates Tannahill is in the corridor outside the door, with the door 3 inches ajar by my own arrangement. I should be obliged, ma'am, by your sitting." Connie sat. The Duke sat in the wing chair across the fire from her. He folded his hands flat on his knees. He looked at the small fire on the hearth for the count of, by the housekeeper's later quiet account, through the 3-inch gap in the door, perhaps 2 minutes. He said, without looking up, Miss Marchand Pickering. On the morning of the 26th, when I put on this waistcoat in my dressing room and saw, in the long pier glass, that the work had been done, I thought for a moment, and I will tell you this only because I do not wish to tell anyone else, and you, ma'am, have earned. I thought for a moment that my late wife had returned. Not in the foolish sense in which a husband sometimes wishes such a thing, but in the small, precise sense that the work in the upper curve of the pomegranate could not, by any ordinary explanation, have been done by any other hand. I held the lapel for some time. I went down to the carriage. I rode to Westminster. I delivered the speech on the floor of the Lords, with the small heraldic pomegranate in red silk thread sitting at the inner left breast of the waistcoat over my heart. I want to tell you, ma'am, that I delivered the speech with a steadiness I have not had in 5 years. The amendment was defeated. Lord Liverpool's government has, I am informed by his lordship's secretary, withdrawn it. I have, ma'am, returned home to the hall this evening with the intention, formed in the carriage between Banbury and the village, of asking Mrs. Yates Tannahill the name of the woman whose hand had done the work, and of asking the woman, when I knew her name, whether the hand was attached to a person of her own keeping, or, being a young woman in her Grace's service, to a person otherwise spoken for. I have asked Mrs. Yates Tannahill the first question. I am asking you, ma'am, the second. He looked up. Connie did not say anything for the count of perhaps 3 of the long case clock's slow seconds. She said, in the same steady voice, I am of my own keeping, Your Grace. He said, Thank you, Miss Marchand Pickering. I shall not this evening ask you anything further. I shall ask Mrs. Yates Tannahill, with your permission, to relieve you tomorrow morning of all your duties at this hall, except those of mending and embroidery. Work, ma'am, in which you have demonstrated yourself to me to be the most accomplished hand at present in residence in this house. The increase in your wages will be reflected at quarter day. The change of duty does not, in any other respect, alter your station in the household. You are not, by this conversation, anything other than what you were when you came in this evening, ma'am. I am not, by this conversation, asking anything of you. I am thanking you. In addition, Miss Marchand Pickering, with your permission and at the speed of your own choosing in the coming weeks, I should like, when I am next at the morning room window, which I have not entered in 5 years, for you to be in the room. I should like to show you, in the upper east cupboard, the work-box of my late wife. I should like to ask you, when you have looked at the work-box, whether you would be willing to take the work-box to your own attic chamber and to use, of the threads in it, what you find a use for. The Duchess's hand is no longer here, ma'am. The work is. The thread is. The household, in particular this autumn, has need of both. He paused. He said, very quietly, Good night, Miss Marchand Pickering. Mrs. Yates Tannahill will see you up. Connie rose. She curtsied. She said, Good night, Your Grace. She went out. Mrs. Yates Tannahill, standing in the corridor, took her arm. They went up the back stair together. They did not speak. If you have stayed with us this far, dear listener, I should ask, before I close the candle on this evening's chapter, that you take a moment to mark the small bookmark in your imagination at this page, because what came between the 3rd of November, 1814, and noon on Sunday the 25th of December, 1814, is a chapter that we shall, in our next installment, read together by the next candle. The summary of that chapter, however, dear listener, you may take with you to your bed tonight in 6 quiet paragraphs. The Duke of Whitlock and Constance Marchand Pickering were, between the 3rd of November and the 22nd of December, in the same library on 6 occasions, always in the gentle deferential presence of Mrs. Yates Tannahill, or Lady Cornelia, the Duke's elder unmarried sister, who had come down from London on the 3rd weekend of November, on a single brief letter from Mrs. Yates Tannahill, describing, in the careful neutral language of a 40-year housekeeper, the matter that had begun to take its slow shape in the library on the evening of the 3rd, and always in the careful slow widening of an acquaintance that, by every account in the housekeeper's notebook, neither of the two persons concerned hurried by a single hour. The Duke showed Connie, on the 7th of November, the upper east cupboard of the morning room. The cupboard that had been closed on his standing instruction since the 11th of October, 1809, and that he had not, in the 5 autumns since, opened. He opened it at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of the 7th of November, in the presence of Mrs. Yates Tannehill and Connie. The cupboard held the late Duchess's lacquered rosewood workbox, with the 18 pale gold and 3 dark red bobbins of silk, the small velvet leaf of needles, the small tortoiseshell and pearl embroidery frame, the Duchess's slim, leather-bound personal journal of the autumn of 1808, 3 small framed pencil sketches the Duchess had made of the south parterre, a small folded square of pale blue baby linen which the Duchess had embroidered for the small private first hope she had not, in 1808 or 1809, told the household had existed, and which had ended in early miscarriage in the spring of 1809, and a small folded letter on heavy cream paper addressed to the Duke in the Duchess's careful slanted hand, which, by the seal across the back of the letter, had not been read in the 5 autumns since her death. The Duke took the cupboard's contents, item by item, out onto the morning-room writing desk. He laid them out. He looked at them for the count of perhaps 3 of the morning-room clock's slow seconds. He said, very quietly, to Connie, "Miss Martian Pickering, the workbox, the frame, the bobbins, the needles, these are yours, ma'am, on the terms I described in the library 4 nights ago. Take them up to your chamber tomorrow morning if Mrs. Yates Tannehill judges the matter proper. The journal I should like, with your permission, to read aloud to you on a future evening, in the library, in Mrs. Yates Tannehill's presence. The pencil sketches I shall keep on this desk. The folded square of baby linen I shall keep also. The letter?" He paused. He looked at the letter. He laid his right hand on it. He said, "The letter, with Mrs. Yates Tannehill's permission, I shall read tonight, alone, in my study, before the fire. I shall not, in the morning, speak of its contents to you, ma'am, or to anyone. I beg you to understand that." Connie said, in her own small, steady voice, "I understand, Your Grace." Connie took the late Duchess's workbox to her attic chamber on the morning of the 8th, on Mrs. Yates Tannehill's careful confirmation that this was, in the view of the household, an honorable and not an irregular receipt. She set the workbox at the right of her own small pine sewing table beneath the dormer window. She did not, on the morning of the 8th, open it. She opened it on the morning of the 9th, after the small night's sleep she had been wanting since the afternoon of the 11th of October, 1809. She unspooled, that morning, 3 of the 18 pale gold bobbins onto her own small wooden spool rack, beside the bobbins her Aunt Adeline had given her in 1808. She set, that morning, a single sail needle from the velvet leaf at the head of her own velvet leaf. She did not, that morning, do any further work on any garment of the hall. She sat at the table for an hour with the workbox open in front of her, in the soft, cool November morning light through the dormer pane. And she said, very quietly, into the small, steady, patient air of the attic chamber, 3 sentences. The first was, "Your Grace, I have the workbox." The second was, "Your Grace, the hands, the threads, the Duchess, the household." The third was, "Your Grace, he needs them. I am here." She closed the workbox. She went down to the morning's duties. The Duke read aloud to Connie, on the evening of the 14th in the library, the late Duchess's small leather-bound journal of the autumn of 1808, which contained the original embroidery pattern of the pomegranate, in Mrs. Yates Tannehill's gentle deferential presence, in a 3rd wing chair set at a careful slight angle to the fire. He read for 48 minutes. He read the journal's complete record of the autumn of 1808 in the Duchess's own careful slanted hand. He read the Duchess's small private notes on the autumn weather of that year, the pruning of the south parterre rose bushes, the visiting of the rector and the rector's wife at the 11th of November supper, the keeping of Whitlock Village's harvest tea on the upper lawn on the third Saturday, the small expense in pale gold silk thread which the Duchess had ordered from a Stroud Mill mercer through the post bag at 5 shillings the bobbin in mid-October, the working of the lapel border of the dark green superfine waistcoat across the 2nd and 3rd weeks of November, the careful private design of the small heraldic pomegranate at the inner left breast, which the Duchess had developed across 3 small pencil sketches in the journal's margin between the 18th and the 21st of November, the embroidery of the pomegranate itself across the 4 evenings of the 22nd through the 25th, and the presentation of the finished waistcoat to the Duke in the morning room on the morning of the 2nd of December, 1808. He read the Duchess's exact phrasing of the moment of the presentation. He stopped at the end of the entry of the 2nd of December. He folded the journal closed. He laid it on the small mahogany side table at his right. He looked, for the count of perhaps 3 of the long case clock's slow seconds, into the fire. He said, very quietly, "Miss Marcian Pickering, Mrs. Yates Tannahill." "Thank you, ma'am, for your patience." He said no more. Mrs. Yates Tannahill rose. She offered Connie her arm. The 2 of them went up the back stair together. The library door was closed behind them by the Duke himself. Lady Cornelia arrived at Wadebridge, at the Whitlock Hall. Court at 4:30, on the afternoon of Friday the 18th of November, in her own ducal carriage from London, having been written to by Mrs. Yates Tannahill on the 11th in the careful neutral terms a 40-year housekeeper uses with an absent sister of the house. Lady Cornelia was 43 years old, unmarried, the only surviving sister of the Duke, a woman of small, careful, steady judgment and considerable kindness who had been, since the death of her sister-in-law in 1809, the senior female at the Hall on her brother's standing invitation. She had not, in 5 autumns, accepted the invitation. She accepted it on the 18th. She stayed 9 days. She sat with Connie in the morning room on the afternoon of the 21st for 2 hours, on a careful private interview Mrs. Yates Tannahill had arranged at the Duke's careful private request. She asked Connie, in the small, careful, steady voice that ran in her family for 4 generations, 4 questions. The questions were: had Connie ever been engaged to be married before? What were her own private hopes for her life if the matter under consideration had not arisen? Would she be content to live the remainder of her days at Whitlock Hall and the Mayfair townhouse in the careful, steady carriage of a Duchess of Whitlock? And did she love Connie's brother? Connie's answers were no. To remain in the household in the lady's maid's chamber, for as long as the household had use of her, and to visit her sister Letitia in Worcester at Christmas. Yes, on the further understanding that she would not be required to attend court and would not be required to abandon her own sewing table in the upper east chamber. And yes, since the morning of the 3rd of November in the library, when he had asked her to sit, ma'am, in his late mother's wing chair across the fire from him, Lady Cornelia did not, after the 4th answer, ask any further question. She rose. She kissed Connie on the cheek. She said, in the same small, careful voice, "Welcome, sister." She went down to her brother's library. She told her brother, in 3 sentences which Mrs. Yates Tannahill heard from the corridor, that Connie was a young woman of small, careful, steady patience, that the late Duchess's promise on the morning of the 11th of October, 1809, had been kept by Connie in the manner of a steady promise kept, and that he was to ask the question at the speed of his own choosing in the weeks ahead, and not to be hurried by anyone, including by the careful private wishes of his own elder sister. She returned to London on the afternoon of Saturday, the 27th. The Duke proposed marriage to Constance Marchand Pickering on the afternoon of Saturday, the 17th of December, in the morning room, in Mrs. Yates Tannehill's quiet absence from the room, which had been arranged the day before. The proposal was on the merits and unconditional, and was accompanied by a settlement of an unconditional jointure of £3,000 a year for life. The full text of which the Duke read aloud before he asked the question, after the manner he had told Connie a fortnight earlier was the proper manner, in his late father's 7th autumn of marriage, of the De Winter family's questions of importance. Connie, after the small pause in which she considered the question's merits in the same way she considered the merits of any work of fine needle, said yes. They were married, by special license, in the small parish chapel of St. Mary's at Whitlock Village, at noon on Sunday, the 25th of December, 1814, with Mrs. Adelaide Yates Tannehill and Mr. Holcomb Pendergrass, the steward, standing as witnesses, with Lady Cornelia in the front pew, and with the dark green superfine wool waistcoat embroidered by the Duchess Lucinda in 1808, and mended by Constance in 1814, worn under the Duke's wedding tailcoat over the small heraldic pomegranate at the inner left breast. The new Duchess of Whitlock, dear listener, has lived in residence at Whitlock Hall and at the Mayfair townhouse in the 8 years since. She has, in those 8 years, presented the Duke with 2 daughters and a son, given the late Duchess's workbox a permanent place on the morning room writing desk, with the threads still unspooled in it for daily use, kept the small coronet rosebush at the corner of the south terrace, pruned on the 2nd Sunday of November each year in the late Duchess's manner, and supervised, on the standing committee of which she is now the senior member, the household charity at the village school of Whitlock. She continues, in the long quiet of the small hours when the candle is low on her own writing desk, to do fine needlework upon any garment in the household that has need of it, including, on 3 occasions in the 8 years, further repairs to the dark green superfine wool waistcoat which the Duke wears, on private evenings in the library, to this hour. If you are ever, dear listener, in a small attic chamber at the top of the east wing servants' stair of a great country house in Warwickshire on a long October night, with a clean square of pale, unbleached linen on the small pine sewing table at the dormer window, and a single tallow candle lit and a request from a kind elder housekeeper folded across your knee, I will say only this. The needle in the velvet leaf is a needle, the thread on the bobbin is a thread, and the 8 quiet hours between 6:30 in the evening and 5 of the following morning are 8 hours. The work is the work. The pomegranate at the inner left breast can be reconstructed by patience in 1,243 split stitches. The herringbone in the inner seam allowance can be drawn out, lifted, and relaid. The candle will gutter. The small fire on the coal grate will hold. The morning will come. The waistcoat will be returned to the hanger. The Duke will dress. The carriage will leave for Westminster at 7. The amendment will be defeated by a majority of 14. The carriage will return on the 3rd of November. The bell will ring for Mrs. Yates Tannehill. The Duke will ask her in a steady voice that is nevertheless not the voice he has used to her in 5 years, whether she would be so good as to summon the upper housemaid in charge of the family wardrobe to the library, whose name he has, until that hour, been unable, despite his shame in admitting it, to recall. The candle on your bedside is low, dear listener. The fire on your hearth has fallen quite into ash. The night is large, and the world is quiet. Connie's daughter Anne, born in the spring of 1816, named for her father's late mother, sleeps beside her own husband 3 counties over, with the small framed primrose Connie copied at 16 on the wall above her writing desk. Connie's son Henry, born in the autumn of 1818, named for his father, is at the Mayfair townhouse this season. Connie's 3rd child, Lucinda, born in the spring of 1821, named in memory of the Duchess who taught Connie the threads, is this evening at the small pine sewing table by the dormer window of the upper east chamber, with a tallow candle of her own and a needle of her own, learning the proper turn of a fly stitch from her mother. The rest of the long, gentle tale we shall read together by the next candle. Good night.